The Cold War is a state of political, ideological, economic, and military hostility between two superpowers, with one in the Western Bloc, which was the United States and their allies, and the other in the Eastern Bloc, which was the Soviet Union and their allies, also known as the Russians or USSR. The war is given the term cold because it was characterized by ideological and propaganda campaigns. There was never any physical fighting. It wasn't heated up by an armed conflict. Everything was done through spying, threats of destruction, gathering of military allies, weaponry, propaganda campaigns, etc. Even the exploration of outer space and Olympic competitions were part of the Cold War. The addition of nuclear weapons in this era made the outcome of any such war extremely hazardous to the entire world. These tensions existed roughly from 1945 to 1991. The two superpowers after World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States, played a central role in shaping, influencing, and rebuilding the post-war world. A clash of very different beliefs and ideology, capitalism versus communism, formed the basis of an international power struggle, with both sides competing for global dominance, exploiting every opportunity of expansion anywhere in the world. Each sought to create a world sympathetic to Soviet communist or U.S. capitalist hegemony. The U.S. believed in capitalism, which is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Basically, they were free. However, the Soviet Union believed in communism, which is a social organization in which all economic and social activity is controlled by a dictatorial state dominated by a single and unbounded political party. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers, which consist of Germany, Italy, and Japan, can be remembered by G.I. Joe. They opposed the Allied powers, and the necessity of defeating them is what glued the Axis nations together. However, the relationship between the two nations was a tense one. Americans had long been doubtful of Soviet communism and concerned about Russian leader Joseph Stalin's tyrannical, bloodthirsty rule of his own country. For their part, the Soviets resented the Americans' decades-long refusal to treat the USSR as a legitimate part of the international community, as well as their delayed entry to the World War II, which resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. Near the end of World War II, the big three allies, the United States, Britain, and the USSR, also known as Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met on the Crimean Peninsula at the Yalta Conference at the end of the war to collaborate on what would happen post-war. The fear was that once World War II was over, the United States was going to be at it with the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt or Churchill didn't want that. What was done was Stalin promised to have free elections if he could keep his army in Eastern Europe. That wasn't going to happen, so they created the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is a term used in the West to refer to the boundary line which divided Europe into two separate areas of political influence from the end of World War II until the end of the Cold War. During this period, Eastern Europe was under the political control and or influence of the Soviet Union, while Western Europe enjoyed political freedom. One of the events that happened during the Cold War was the Berlin Airlift, where the USSR attempted to cut off Western access to Berlin. For a year, the United States and Britain flew supplies into the western sector of Berlin. So the Soviets lifted the blockade and later built the Berlin Wall, which divided the pro-West sector of Berlin from its communist half. The Big Three, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was replaced by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and U.S. President Harry Truman met in Potsdam, Germany to negotiate terms for the end of World War II. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the Allied leaders agreed to meet over the summer at Potsdam to continue the discussions that had begun at Yalta. The Potsdam Conference is perhaps best known for President Truman's July 24, 1945 conversation with Stalin. President Truman was confident that the U.S. would not need much help from the Soviets to defeat Japan because of the successful test of the atomic bomb. So he informed the Soviet leader. Stalin, however, was already well informed about the US nuclear program thanks to the Soviet intelligence network, so he also held firm in his positions. This situation made negotiations challenging. The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, who, despite their differences, had remained allies throughout the war, never met again collectively to discuss cooperation in post-war reconstruction. On March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman presented the Truman Doctrine before a joint session of Congress. His message asked Congress for $400 million in military and economic assistance for Turkey and Greece. This crystallized the U.S. perception of a world divided between free and enslaved peoples. Another important occurrence during the Cold War was the Marshall Plan. As a part of the U.S. containment doctrine to limit the expansion of communism and to help its Western European allies recover from the war, the U.S. sent billions of dollars in economic and construction aid to West Germany, England, France, and other Western European nations. The plan rebuilt factories, roads, and boomed Western Europe and Japan's economies. The USSR attempted a similar aid package for Eastern Europe, called Comecon, but its efforts were less successful. In 1949, the U.S. formed an alliance with Western Europe nations called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. It was designed to contain Soviet aggression in Europe. Canada and Turkey were also included. The USSR responded with a military alliance of its own, the Warsaw Pact, which most Eastern European nations were compelled to join. Despite their many differences, the superpowers were among the nations that agreed to the creation of the United Nations. The UN was dedicated to maintaining international peace and security and promoting friendly relations among the world's nations. It offered an alternative for global reconstruction that was independent of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War occurred when the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, thought that he could institute a little freedom and still be communist and command the economy. He developed two strategies, one called Glasnost, the opening up of freedom, and the other Perestroika, which was the restructuring of the economy and making it a little more free. When Gorbachev instituted some slight freedoms, it made the Russians want more of it, and he couldn't control what was happening. Boris Yeltsin became the face of the reform movement, and the Soviet Union broke up into many little countries instead of being that one big union. A lot of people think that the breakup of the Soviet Union was one way to see that the Cold War was over. Also, before that occurred, the Berlin Wall was broken down, and that would be very symbolic of the Cold War being over. After the Cold War, Germany was unified, and Russia and Eastern Europe had to work on rebuilding their economy, which was devastated by years of a commanding economy and lack of growth. And the United States became the superpower of the New World Order, which they hoped would be marked with security and prosperity. Thanks for watching.